the eastern base of the Giza Plateau, below the pyramids, is another stunning symbol from ancient Egypt, the Great Sphinx.
He who has challenged the stony stare of the Sphinx, alone in the silence of the desert, is apt to read his own interpretation of the mystery of life and of death, which perhaps it symbolizes. Arthur Silver White, historian, author, 1899.
This strange sculpture, this mysterious mixture of man and beast, crouches in front of the pyramid complex of Kefron, quietly keeping the secret of its true significance.
In Giza, the Sphinx is anonymous. There are no texts that really tell us, here's why we made the Sphinx, here's what we think about it, but we know with high probability that it was made during the time of Khafre, the builder of the second Giza pyramid. It sits just in back of his valley temple, and so it kind of guards the entrance to the whole pyramid complex, in fact to the whole Giza necropolis as a whole.
In ancient Egypt, sphinxes were traditionally guardians. They protected sacred places like the entrances to temples and the underworld. The Sphinx, the giver of life, of stability and of power, the director of truth, the ruler of the upper and lower world, like the sun, forever and ever. Ancient Egyptian inscription, 1350 BC. Throughout the ages, this amazing creature has been interpreted as the symbol of many things. For the Greeks, it was thought to be a representation of occult wisdom. For the medieval Arabs, it was Abu-Hul, or Father of Terror. But in the beginning, experts say it was nothing more than an outcrop of unwanted rock.
It's the remains of an ancient quarry. And rather than removing it completely, because it seems to have been an area of bad stone which the Egyptians couldn't figure out what to do with, and so rather than just blast it away, someone with a little bit of vision, that is, a true sculptor or an artist, said, hey, I can do something with that.
The result of that vision is this colossus that seems to effortlessly transform animal into man.
The Sphinx has all the power of the lion, but the head is not only the head of a man, it's the head of the ultimate man, the man god, the pharaoh, wearing the Nemes scarf in the folds that only the king was allowed to wear in his scarf. And this outline of the Sphinx symbolized the order imposed by divine rule over the natural world.
The Great Sphinx, like the pyramids it protects, is massive. Its body measures 240 feet, more than 3/4 the length of a football field. Its head rises to 66 feet in height, or what would be the equivalent of a 6-story building.
This combining on a gigantic scale of the lion with the king must have conveyed that the head of this household was not only powerful in the form of a king, but was powerful like the gods, could combine with the very forces of nature, emerge right out of the living rock as the Sphinx to receive what is due him as the head of this household that continues forever in the afterlife.
The Sphinx is striking, even though its form has been marred. Throughout the ages, man has been blamed for its damaged face. Early in the 15th century AD, an Arab historian reported that a man angry with the people, still engrossed with ancient Egyptian mysticism, smashed off the nose. Napoleon, too, was said to have helped destroy the ancient image, but according to many Egyptologists, this is simply part of the folklore surrounding the mysterious creature. They claim most of its destruction was caused by the ancient Egyptians' #1 enemy, time. stand before the silent mystery of the Sphinx. Its time-scarred, weather-beaten face looks out upon the plain and fronts the rising sun, as it has done these many thousands of years, and still we question its mute lips to its age and origin. James Henry Preston, founder of the Oriental Institute, University of Chicago, 1905. Its disfigured face has left some unanswered questions concerning its likeness, but many Egyptologists believe it was carved around 2500 BC to resemble the king who rested in the very pyramid it silently secures.
The Great Sphinx of Giza, of course, is thought to represent Khephren, and if you look carefully at the features of the Sphinx, insofar as they're preserved, you'll see many similarities between Khephren, but Old Kingdom kings in particular, in the way the features are done.
The square jaw, the arched eyebrows, and the high cheekbones prompt experts to believe that this sculpture was created during the 4th dynasty, the same period the pyramids of Giza were built. To further prove the point, the past met the present through technology in 1989, when Egyptologists combined their knowledge with the skills of architects to recreate the Great Sphinx in its original form. They took the features of the Great Sphinx, and then, using a comparison of Khephren, they added a nose, a beard, and more of a headdress. They also added a statue that was put there during a later period. The computer's ability was used to electronically perform a function much like a paintbrush. The result? A complete image of what this stone statue may have looked like over 4,000 years ago. The likeness of the Sphinx is just one question concerning its age. This immense statue was made out of a series of limestone layers. The bottom layer, the foundation, is hard limestone, while the middle layer runs from hard to soft and then back to hard again. The head was carved out of a strong building stone, which has enabled it to remain more intact than the rest of the body. It is all this stone that has become the source of great debate. There are those that believe the Sphinx was constructed possibly as long ago as 9000 BC, but many Egyptologists believe archaeological evidence suggests otherwise.
It's surrounded by all these hundreds, maybe thousands of tombs, the pyramids, the causeways, the boats, the statues. All of the material looks like the material of the time of Khufu, Khafre, and Menkaure. Its location, its context, its position within the general sequence of Egyptian architecture and art that suggests it was made at this time during the 4th dynasty, and its context within Khepren's pyramid complex suggests it was made by him. It's that kind of evidence that we build up probabilities.
The Great Sphinx seems at home here. Its shape somehow completes this landscape primarily filled with geometric forms.
Spirit here triumphs over matter. The solid stone speaks of the genius that was wrought and the myth and mystery that surrounded these ancient monuments. The colossal pyramids nearby are bathed in a haze which, mingling with the night shadows at their base, destroys their crushing materiality. A silence that can be felt increases the spell and lures one away. Arthur Silver White, 1899.
The Sphinx is yet another example of the ancient Egyptians' incredible ability to create. Throughout the Giza Plateau, they brought their gifted sense of design. It was here they took a desolate area and created an everlasting picture using stone imagery.
There's a whole balance there. It's what they call in art informal balance. This cannot be coincidence. They were standing back with a blank palette, and each king following Khufu was adding his element with some respect and very careful alignment to the architecture of his father or grandfather who came before. So there was a coherency to the design at Giza.
For the ancients, the addition of the Great Sphinx may have been more than just an architectural enhancement. Its location seems to suggest they chose to carve this unwanted block of stone for a particular reason.
When the Egyptians built monumental architecture, to some extent they were simply writing in hieroglyphs on the scale of acres. They didn't draw a distinction between architecture, writing, and art. It was all kind of hieroglyphic, so that the Sphinx is a gigantic hieroglyph.
According to experts, when standing below and a bit to the side of the Great Sphinx, it is centered between the pyramids, and it can be read as a giant hieroglyph. The two pyramids frame the creature's head, and some say the ancients may have seen the head as a disc rising between two mountains. Experts believe that its placement in relation to the pyramids was like a representation of the sunrise. After all, long after the Great Sphinx's construction, it became known in the ancients' inscriptions as Hora Market, or Horus in the horizon. Scholars add that this theory works well with the Egyptians' religious beliefs during the construction of Khephrun's pyramid complex in 2500 BC. It was at that time that their ideas concerning the god Ra were well developed. The Sphinx and its surrounding structures, like the temple sunken below its paws, emphasized those beliefs. Originally, this temple had 24 granite pillars that surrounded a courtyard. Experts claim these pillars were symbolic of the 12 hours of the daytime, as well as the 12 hours of the night.
There's some evidence that during the astronomical mid-year, during sunset, the pyramid and the Sphinx are merging as silhouettes, while the sun is shining into the temple over the western roofed part into the eastern sanctuary, which symbolized the rising sun, and illuminating an image of the rising sun, which is kind of forecasting its own eventual rise as it goes through the journey of the underworld.
Like pyramids, the Sphinx and its temple are considered creative marvels. But for the ancients, they were much more.
It wasn't viewed as creativity was a value, that here's a guy who's really doing something new. What the Egyptians wanted to do was maintain order. There was a divine order, and that you wanted everything to remain the same.
The pharaoh, the man-god responsible for this ancient place, could change form. As the god Horus, the falcon, he could combine with the sun god Ra in all its aspects, and then transform into the powerful figure of a lion to help ensure the safety of the ancient Egyptians' lifestyle. The Great Sphinx may have been a sacred symbol to the people of the 4th dynasty, but when the civilization changed, Giza was abandoned. This massive statue became a victim of the plateau it had once protected. Then in the 15th century BC, a man came upon this sand-enveloped object. According to Egyptian legend, the Great Sphinx began to play the part of communicator. This time it imparted valuable information that would eventually make this man a king. The pyramids and Great Sphinx were constructed between 2575 and 2465 BC, during the period in Egyptian history known as the Old Kingdom. When the Old Kingdom collapsed in 2150 BC, the glory of the Giza Plateau ended. After After many centuries, the civilization reassembled and established the Middle Kingdom. But the era of grand pyramid construction was over. 500 years later, the Middle Kingdom crumbled too. For over 1,000 years, the desert sand was left to envelop these sacred structures. While the watchful guardians smothered in sand, the grand triangles became symbolic of something more than stairways to the heavens. They became limestone beacons that signaled the location of abundant treasures.
Theoretically, the necropolis area, the cemeteries, were off limits. They're called the sacred land, the elevated land, the lofty land that people were not supposed to go into. But the cemeteries get abandoned, kind of like ghost towns, and then people creep into them and start unloading all the treasure which is in them.
For the ancients, the plundering of tombs presented a serious problem. It went against their entire belief system.
By destroying a tomb, you effectively killed that person in the afterlife. It was one of the worst crimes in the world, especially to rob a king's tomb. These kings were semi-divine, they were representatives of the gods, these were the kings who maintained the order of the universe, and it's hard to imagine, considering the morality of that civilization, any more heinous crime than the royal tomb robberies, and people were doing it.
In the 16th century BC, almost 1,000 years after the construction of the grand objects upon the Giza Plateau, the New Kingdom began. This was Egypt's golden age. The people celebrated the re-emergence of a powerful monarchy, and again they hoped their lifestyle would be protected from beyond. Tombs, like massive monuments, were left to the past. The pyramid shape was still symbolic, but robberies had prompted a search for a more secret site for tombs. Over 450 miles up the Nile from Giza, across from what was then the Egyptian capital of Thebes, the ancients thought they had found the perfect site. The location worked well with the mythology concerning creation. There, a naturally formed mound loomed above an area known as the Valley of the Kings.
If you're standing in the Valley of the Kings and look up toward the end of the valley, you see that there's an enormous stone pyramid, which is the mountain peak, the holy mountain, overshadowing this burial place. So in this case, one enormous pyramid serves for all kings.
The kings are buried now in the hillside, in tombs cut deep into the earth in some cases, without anything to mark them outside other than a doorway. In a sense, the tombs in the New Kingdom have become more inaccessible, hopefully, than they were earlier.
Some of the most famous pharaohs were buried here, and many of their mummies still survive. There is Tutankhamun, the Boy King, Ramses II, better known as Ramses the Great, and Seti I, Ramses' father. All these carefully preserved men were part of the powerful New Kingdom. This was an era of excavation and restoration for many of the old monuments. Suddenly many of the structures were given new life, and the Great Sphinx, too, was rediscovered. The kings of the 18th dynasty were the first to reign. The rulers included Thutmose IV, the first man responsible for freeing the sand-encumbered Sphinx.
Once a shame, it so happened that the king's son Thutmose had come hunting at noon, and afterwards rested in the shadow of this great god.
And he indicates that the sand covered the Sphinx nearly up to its neck. And the Sphinx came to him in a dream as the god of kingship, Atum, Ra, and the sun god in all its aspects. And it said, Thutmose.
Look at me, Thutmose, my son. I am your father, Horus in the horizon, Kepri Re Atum. I promise what is in my gift, earthly rule at the head of all the living. All the territory on which the eye of the sun rests will be yours. To you I turn my face and heart for protection, since I am sick in all my limbs. The sands of the holy place upon which I rest have covered me.
Wake up. Free me from the desert sand, and it implies that I'll make you the king of Egypt. And unfortunately, the text is eroded away just where he jumps up to say, yes, and let's do it.
He evidently cleared the Sphinx of sand and received the kingdom in fulfillment of the promise made. Subsequent generations had the incident recorded as the story of how he gained the throne by an oracle of God. James Henry Breasted, 1905. Tutmosis claimed the Sphinx had struck a bargain with him, and the great god that inhabited the statue had repaid him well. Interestingly, during the time of his dream, Tutmosis was not the crown prince, which leaves many experts to question this otherworldly forecast of his rise to Pharaoh.
We found that there is something politics in this story, because he killed his elder brother, who's supposed to be the king of Egypt, and that's why he made this story to show that the god Hor-Em-Akhet, Horus of the horizon, it shows him to be the king of Egypt.
The ancient conversation between Tutmosis and the Great Sphinx is found on a tablet directly under its chest. Despite the politics surrounding the story, the tablet contains the oldest archaeological report on the ruined state of the Great Sphinx from a king. The inscription reads like a record of events, and this has enabled archaeologists to examine one man's motivation and then his following actions.
They made a whole new kind of royal national park around the Sphinx with mud brick little rest houses for pharaohs and so on, and they reclad the Sphinx in stone casing. It was the first restoration project of the Sphinx as a national image of Egypt.
Tutmosis IV revived the landscape. The Giza Plateau became an ancient marvel even to those living in ancient times. Tutmosis had generously kept his promise to the Great Sphinx. He had cleared, reclad, and built walls to protect this age-old statue, and then he finished the restoration by adding some color.
It was very common for the Egyptians to paint statues. The rule was not to leave it in the fine-grained stone that we so appreciate as objects in our museums, but rather to make it effective by painting it almost in bright comic book colors. And in fact, the painting of the statue brought it to life.
Once again, Egyptologists and architects combined their efforts to produce a three-dimensional image of a painted Great Sphinx. Egyptologists gathered information from both the colored stains still evident upon the Sphinx, as well as what is known of other painted statues from Egypt. The result, a very stylized and formal view of this majestic creature, and some insight into the ancients' thoughts.
You paint yourself. You don't try to show the face of a man with his wrinkles at age 40 or 5 or 50 or whatever. It's not meant to be a portrait. It's meant to be an image of the king as an idealized being, dressed up as fancy as we dress ourselves up to go to a ball at the White House. But here, instead of going to a formal ball at the White House, you're going to the greatest formal event of all time, a kind of meeting with the realm of the gods.
For the ancient Egyptians, the Great Sphinx was an idealized image of God and man. It was a guardian to the plateau, and it was a communicator. A communicator that existed in both the land of the living and the world of the dead. often there was more than one function for man-made creations. The Great Sphinx was no exception. According to some Egyptologists, this guardian of the Giza Plateau may have actually had a higher purpose than to protect the pyramids while staring into the face of the Egyptian sunrise throughout eternity.
I think the Sphinx was a kind of dialogue between the living and the dead, and the Sphinx in its temple was a place of liminality. Liminal means a threshold kind of place between this world and the rather dangerous weirdness of the other world, of the land of the dead.
The Sphinx ignores the desert at its feet. Its gaze is bent on the sand-swept horizon, the threshold of the unknown, the bourne of the spirit world. It is a dream in stone. Arthur Silver-White, historian, author, 1899.
An ancient Egyptian belief took place in the sculpture of the Great Sphinx. The statue was designed as a representation of the dead pharaoh, and through this statue, the dead pharaoh was capable of affecting the ancients' daily lives from beyond.
Our concept of art for art's sake was foreign to the Egyptians. Each statue had a purpose. The statues were for the soul to inhabit, so that the soul could come and go freely and essentially be that person.
Statues for spirits were found in tombs. They were similar to the mummy. They, too, outlined the deceased. Only their form was an idealized image of the dead, and they were often visible, unlike the mummies who were safely tucked away. On the day of burial, the deceased's final resting place within the tomb was closed. No living person was allowed to enter the room specifically designed for the spirit. So the tomb statues became the buried mummy's proxy, for whom family, friends, and in the cases of kings, loyal followers could pay homage and actually give food offerings.
Now, the ancient Egyptians making these offerings could see that nothing was happening to them. No spirit was coming out and gobbling them up. And so you may ask yourself why they continued to do this. The reason was because they knew that if a living being doesn't get food, it dies. So what they were offering was not the physical food itself, but the life force within the food, which somehow the spirit was supposed to be able to partake of and continue to live.
Having been cared for and nourished, the deceased spirit within the tomb statue could then bestow blessings upon visitors. The statues were sacred, and like the mummies, they had rituals performed on them by priests. Before the mummy was locked away within the tomb, the deceased would be laid in front of his statues or in front of his coffin, which could serve as a statue. Then, the most important rite in the funerary process was performed, the opening of the mouth ceremony.
The opening of the mouth ceremony was primarily so that the mummy would be able to say the important spells when it got to the next world. An implement is touched to the mouth, and you said you were young again, you live again.
Thy mouth was closed. I open for thee thy mouth. I open for thee thy two eyes. The deceased shall walk and speak, and his body shall be with the great company of the gods in the great house of the ancient one.
So the mummy will now be able to speak in the next world, to say the magical spells that will be necessary to get up again.
But the mummy wasn't the only one to come under the care of priests during the ceremony. When the magical ceremony was finally completed, the the idealized figures were ready to stand as proxies for the body throughout eternity.
You kept your own form. You were not your spirit, your energy did not enter another person. You don't have an idea of reincarnation where you'll inhabit somebody else's statue or assume somebody else's identity. This is why the Egyptians were so intent on making statues of people, because those were visual reminders of individuals.
These visual reminders possessed the deceased spirit, which needed to move between two worlds. The ancient Egyptians tried to ensure this by carving a niche directly into the tomb wall. This niche was known as a false door, and for the ancient Egyptians the false door served as a passageway. It was considered both the entrance and the exit between the land of the living and the land of the dead.
You have granted that my soul and my shape may walk on their feet to the place where this person is, so that he may stand, sit, and enter into his chapel of eternity, because I am one of the entourage of Osiris, who goes by night and returns by day, and no God can be created when I am silent.
There's one tomb in particular where the tomb owner carved himself coming out of the floor in the false doorway with his arms outstretched like this to receive the offerings. This kind of frontal image of the deceased re-outlined in the form of a statue, like the mummy almost coming forth, not literally but in the statue. I think the Sphinx is also like these statues in the tombs, because in the design of the architecture around the Sphinx, the only way the people of the 4th dynasty could see the Sphinx was from the front. So the Sphinx presents this frontal image with its own temple down in front of it, where offerings were made to the sun god and to the king.
For the people of the New Kingdom, the statue shared their reality as well as the one beyond. For the pharaoh, the great Sphinx and the area surrounding played a part in the ruler's ceremonial rites.
It became a place where kings, in the first year of their rule, the first year that they went to the throne, would come and be ordained on the throne as the head of the royal household at this ancient symbol of kingship and the god Atum.
This ancient symbol of kingship maintained its position of power among the people for 2,000 years, but Egypt would again change, and the hot sands would once more try to choke the spirit from the sacred statue. Egypt has been called the gift of the Nile, and for the ancients this most certainly was true. For the neighboring nations it was a rare gem over which many wars would be waged. Despite the efforts to appeal to various gods, nothing could stop the civilization from slipping out of the native pharaoh's powerful hands. After over 2,000 years, order was leaving the land, and chaos was anxiously awaiting to take its place. The Persians were the first to invade, and then take control in 525 BC. They would be followed in 332 BC by Alexander the Great, which made Egypt part of the Greek Empire. And the Romans came. The end was near for the ancients' lifestyle, although at first both the Greeks and the Romans seemed agreeable to native Egyptian ways of worship.
In the Roman period, they did more repairs. They added yet another layer of casing around this lion body with the softer layers that were so subject to erosion. And we have inscriptions in Greek mentioning Roman emperors who were paying attention to the Sphinx. And so it was a cyclical thing. Once again, it's being renewed as a kind of national image. Now, yet another 1,000 years later.
The renewal of the Sphinx would last a while, but its meaning would eventually become a mystery. The ancient belief system was becoming blurred by the flood of foreign influence. By the 2nd century AD, the Sphinx was among the many images that were misunderstood. It was no longer a man-made construction built for a king, but rather a creation of the gods.
Your fearful forms, the work of the deathless gods. To spare the flat and fertile lands, they placed you in your depression, a rocky island from which they banished the sands. They placed you as a neighbor to the pyramids, as a holy servant who vigilantly watches the blessed Osiris. Ancient inscription, 2nd century AD.
Like the cycles of restoration and renewal, the Sphinx would again fall into a state of decline. As Christian theology gripped the civilization, the original beliefs which gave life to the mummies and monuments were desperately gasping for air. It was during the 4th century when the temples were closed or destroyed and the last of the hieroglyphs were carved in stone. The ancient culture so closely associated with the pharaonic rule had ended. The creature that embodied both God and man, the great Sphinx, shared in the destructive time. It was covered to its neck in sand, having once again been left in the desert's boiling embrace. By 640 AD, Egypt was an Arab nation and no longer an ancient empire. The meaning behind the spectacular monuments, massive structures, and carefully wrapped mummies had drifted away. The beliefs that had once given these impressive images their firm foundation had faded. It seemed the ancients' number one enemy, time, had finally won the age-old struggle. The civilization was lost. As time passed, ancient symbols like the Great Sphinx became a mystery. Even the paint, still evident upon the creature's face, shed no light on its true significance.
A little more than a bow shot from these pyramids is a colossal figure of a head and neck projecting from the earth. The body to which the head belongs is said to be buried under the earth. On the face is a reddish tint and a red varnish. The face is remarkably beautiful. The mouth in particular has a charming expression. It seems to be smiling gently. Abdul Latif, Arab doctor, 1200 AD.
The Sphinx and the giant monuments it so valiantly protected for thousands of years were no longer sacred. The reasons for their construction were nothing more than a lost memory. But they still served a purpose. They became the stone quarries from which the modern-day Egypt would be built. The next turning point for the battered monuments and sand-encumbered Sphinx came when a battle was fought within their range. A young Corsican general was the victor, and his invasion would have lasting effects. This general was Napoleon Bonaparte.
When Napoleon came in 1798 to Egypt, not only as a military conqueror, but with a whole team of surveyors and scholars to reconnoiter the entire land and all its monuments, and actually it was Napoleon that opened up ancient Egypt to Europe.
Perhaps the The most important discovery during the French invasion was the uncovering of a slab of black rock. The rock would become known as the Rosetta Stone, and in 1822 it became the artifact responsible for breaking the ancients' 1500-year silence. But it did nothing for the Great Sphinx. It remained buried until the 1920s. It took over 10 years to remove the sand, and excavations continue to this day. As archaeologists repair, restore, and once again renew the ancient statue, they continue to search for information buried somewhere within its long history. For now, many questions remain unanswered. The Great Sphinx is a part of the giant jigsaw puzzle created so long ago by the ancients.